Megan could no longer contain her trembling. "Robert, this is a bad idea," she said. "I want to go back. Let's take the usual route. It's very late already. Greenfield Park has been closed for many years. And who knows what's happening here now? I'm scared, Robert. Let's just walk." "We've already talked about this," Robert interrupted, a note of frustration in his voice. "You agreed it would be much quicker this way." "Yes, I agreed. But I didn't think we'd have to walk through the park at night," she pleaded, her eyes searching his for understanding. "Megan?" Robert sighed, stopped, and turned to face his girlfriend, gently embracing her to calm her down. He wasn't thrilled about walking through the closed Greenfield Park either, but they were running late, and his boss, who had invited them to the party, did not appreciate tardiness. "We don't have time to take the usual route, and if we don't make it on time, I'm worried my boss will give the project to someone else. You have to understand, Megan." Megan sighed deeply and gazed into the park. All she could see were trees shrouded in darkness, and it frightened her. There are no street lights in the park at night. Megan made one last desperate attempt to dissuade him. "We have the flashlights on our phones," Robert dismissed her concerns. "Come on, don't panic. It's not that far. I roughly remember the path. I used to come here a lot as a kid. We're running out of time, Megan." "Okay," she exhaled, biting her lip and trying to suppress the feeling that she was making the biggest mistake of her life. "Everything will be fine," he reassured her, gently touching her tightly pursed lips, and took her hand. "I'm with you," his fingers gripping her wrist firmly, offering her a sense of security. "Let's go." "Let's go," Megan nodded, attempting to shake off all her fears. For a brief moment she even succeeded, but then memories of all the rumors associated with this place began to resurface in her mind, sending a new wave of tremors through her body. The last rumor she remembered was about some ritualistic animal killings. Her friend had told her in a terrified whisper about cultists worshipping demons who roamed their small town at night, often seen near Greenfield Park. At the time, she had just laughed it off, but now she was scared. At the entrance to the park, Megan saw a strange symbol on the ground. It was an inverted cross with something that looked like fangs. "Robert," she said, stopping abruptly. "What's wrong?" He turned around. She pointed at the symbol. "It's just graffiti, probably a prank by some kids," he said, moving ahead. Greenfield Park was enclosed by a hedge, and the entrance was blocked by heavy wrought iron gates. However, the lock had been broken for a long time, allowing anyone to enter. Yet many locals avoided the area because of various rumors. Robert turned back as the heavy wrought iron gates slowly creaked open, their rusty hinges squeaking. A sudden gust of wind stirred up a pile of last year's leaves, rustling them in a sound that Megan thought sounded like whispering voices. "Oh my God, did you hear that?" Megan gasped, pressing closer to Robert as she scanned their surroundings. "What?" Robert replied, his voice tinged with confusion. "Did you see something?" Instead of answering, Megan simply sighed, her breath visible in the chilly air. It had grown unexpectedly cold. "They said on the radio it was going to be warm tonight. They were wrong. We need to hurry before it starts raining. Feel how cold it's getting? That's why we need to keep moving. Don't fall behind and watch your step," Robert said in a calm tone, though his nervous lip-licking betrayed his anxiety. "There's nothing to be afraid of. It's just dark. Turn on your phone's flashlight. Just don't let go of me, okay?" she asked, gripping his hand tighter. Without a word, Robert intertwined their fingers and pressed his lips to her warm wrist. Together, they stepped into the park's darkness. The last things Megan remembered were a howl that filled the air, a sudden icy chill, and then a sharp pain that overwhelmed her senses. Cold. Damp. A heavy weight on her chest made it difficult to breathe. Megan groaned as she slowly opened her eyes, her movements more instinctive than deliberate. Leaves, withered grass, twigs, and damp earth surrounded her. A hollow emptiness overwhelmed her, and panic began to set in. She tried to turn her head and winced at the sharp pain. Clenching her teeth, she managed to lift her hand to her head and felt a large, tender bump under her tangled hair. For a few moments, she lay still, trying to gather her strength, then tried to move again. This time, the pain was more tolerable. Carefully avoiding any sudden movements, she tried to sit up and look around. Only the looming trees and rustling bushes met her gaze. The air smelled of damp earth and decay. All was silent. She struggled to recall what had happened before she lost consciousness. Robert. Where was he? Her heart pounded, pushing the pain to the background. Pushing herself to her feet, Megan turned and froze, staring at a spot a few feet away where he lay. Groaning, Megan with great effort moved toward the figure that now resembled a broken doll more than a human. She fell to her knees, almost crying from relief when she saw his chest rise and fall under his torn shirt. He was alive. Her tension eased slightly, but her body shivered uncontrollably from the cold. Megan touched his wrist and quickly pulled back her hand. His skin was burning hot. "Robert," she called hoarsely to her beloved, reaching out to him again. She brushed strands of hair from his face and gasped in horror, examining his lips, which were swollen and blistered. "Robert," she sobbed, feverishly checking his body for injuries. Aside from a few bruises and scratches, there were no other visible wounds. "Robert," she whispered, gently tapping his cheeks. She longed to kiss him, to feel his breath against her lips, but the blisters deterred her, fearing she might cause him more pain. "Darling, don't scare me. Open your eyes. Wake up." The man's eyelashes twitched. He exhaled, and then suddenly cried out softly. His hand flew up, but the girl intercepted it, preventing him from touching lips. "Don't," she said, managing a forced smile as she held his gaze. Eyes that were filled with pain, fear, and confusion. Robert tried to speak, but Megan tightened her grip on his fingers. "Don't talk. You're injured." Robert simply stared at her for a moment, then closed his eyes, masking his pain as his body relaxed. Megan bit her lip and reached for her phone. They needed help, but she would have to process the night's events later, like why her wrists bore bruises from his grip, and why her face felt tight, as if she had been crying all night. At the hospital. "How is he doing?" Megan asked, unable to bring herself to lie down, remaining seated as the doctor entered. "Much better. It's surprising how quickly his burn is healing," the doctor replied, shaking his head in amazement. "Just yesterday, he couldn't even move his lips, but today he's able to use a straw." Megan recalled how long it had taken for Robert's last cut to heal and frowned. "When can we go home?" she asked, putting her worries aside for the moment. "You can be discharged in the next few days, but he'll need to stay longer," the doctor replied. Megan sighed, deciding not to question the doctor's advice. Robert truly needed the care. "Can I see him?" "Only if you promise not to overexert him and to rest afterward," the doctor conceded, stepping aside. In Robert's room. "Hey," Megan said as she opened the door, offering a warm smile. Robert turned from the window, his expression softening. He reached out his hands, and she, taking his warm fingers, sat beside him on the bed. They simply looked at each other for several long moments before Megan began to gently kiss his palms and wrists. "Megan." Robert exhaled and winced as the crust over his burn cracked. "Don't talk." She quickly leaned in and softly blew on his lips. "Just hang on a little longer." To avoid meeting his sorrow-filled gaze, Megan buried her face in his palms. Why was he so warm? As if he were on fire. She resolved to ask the doctor about it later. "You'd better go," the nurse interrupted their quiet moment. "It's time for his treatment." Megan grimaced, caught Robert's pleading look, and reluctantly stood up, letting go of his hand. "Everything will be okay," she whispered, smiled gently, and left the room, feeling a chill set in. As the initial shock subsided, fear and realization crept in. Megan's heart pounded instinctively, and with a soft sigh, she turned to her other side. In the dark, the door seemed to morph into a window, revealing a night sky dotted with faint, barely visible stars. She attempted to count them for a while, but soon dizziness overwhelmed her, and she closed her eyes. Her mind drifted back to that evening. What had happened? Aside from the concussion, the bruises, the scrapes, and the burns, there had been no violence. Nothing was stolen. Their money and other valuables were untouched, though their clothes were torn. The police had combed the entire park but found nothing. Who had attacked them, and what did they want? The bruises on her arms felt as if someone had gripped her forcefully, as if trying to break free. And Robert. His lips looked as if he had been kissed by fiery lips. Suppressing a sudden wave of jealousy, Megan tried to recall anything else from that night, but her memory refused to cooperate. The door to the room clicked open with a soft, unpleasant squeak, and Megan froze, clutching the blanket and staring wide-eyed at the window where fear was mirrored in her eyes. Behind her, she sensed an intense, unsettling gaze that sent shivers down her spine, a mix of cold and heat. Footsteps approached, and her blood turned icy, but before she could shut her eyes, a dark silhouette appeared against the window. Megan swallowed hard, and then suddenly, it was all over. "Darling?" Robert's quiet voice broke the thick silence, nearly bringing her to tears. "You scared me," she said with a trembling voice, sitting up in bed. Then it dawned on her. "Robert, why are you here?" "Sorry." He quickly climbed onto the bed, his tone apologetic. "I had a nightmare, got scared, wanted to be with you, and I—" "Robert?" Megan, struggling to understand what her beloved was saying, reached out to him, and taking his chin, turned his head towards the dim light streaming in from the window. Broken shadows lay on the man's face. His skin seemed to glow, but the girl couldn't see it. There was almost nothing left of the burn. Enchanted, she ran her fingertip along his lower lip, sincerely enjoying its softness, but something was off. "Robert, where's your scar?" she asked. He furrowed his brow, puzzled, and licked his lips. "I don't know," he replied, his expression turning serious. "I guess it disappeared along with the burn." He shrugged nonchalantly a moment later and smiled. "How is that possible? Just earlier tonight you couldn't talk." "I really don't know." He became serious too. "It's like having gaps in my memory. I remember the park, you holding my hand. Then the hospital. I remember being scared. Strange dreams, confusing thoughts." Robert pondered. After a moment of silence, he added, "Then I wandered around the hospital looking for you. But I thought it was all just a dream. And when I found you, it felt like waking up," he concluded. Megan hugged him, resting her head against his chest, drawing comfort from his presence. "We're alive, together, and I want everything to go back to how it was. But something feels off. I can't pinpoint it. It just scares me." Megan paused, her voice laden with concern, and then looked up at Robert. "Why are you so warm?" Where have your scars and burns gone? And the bruises, they've just vanished. It's all so strange, she murmured, her fingers tightening around his. There has to be an explanation. Perhaps it's all the aftermath of shock, fear from the unknown, and the burns disappeared due to treatment. Medicine has made huge advances recently, he replied, trying to reassure her. I don't want to think about the worst. You're right. There must be an explanation. Right now, I just want to be with you, she said, her voice tinged with sadness. Forgive me, he whispered. If only I had listened to you back then. I went after you on my own. Don't blame yourself. Let's just not think about it for now. Megan shook her head, dismissing the thought. You don't want to find out what happened? Robert asked, genuinely surprised. He remembered Megan as timid yet always curious. I do and I don't. She looked away, conflicted. But whenever I try to forget, I can't help but wonder, what if it happens again? It won't happen again if we stay away from the park. You're right. Let's just forget it all, Robert suddenly declared with an unexpected firmness. Megan's brow furrowed as she detected an unfamiliar tone in Robert's voice. Authoritative, sharp, cold. If that's what you want, I do, Robert said abruptly, his demeanor shifting, becoming distant. Okay, Megan breathed out cautiously, a chill running through her as she felt a cold touch on her heart. What was happening? I have to go back, he said as he stepped away. His features became indistinct, but Megan could still see his eyes clearly, their dim glow unsettling. She blinked, wondering if her mind was playing tricks on her. When she looked again, Robert was already at the door. See you tomorrow, sweetheart. Try to get some sleep and don't worry about anything. The door creaked shut, and Megan was left alone. She took a deep breath, and only then realized how tense she had been. What just happened? It couldn't have been her imagination, could it? Robert had always been different, yet he had always been himself. She had felt his presence, recognized him beyond any facade. But now, just minutes ago, he had been kissing her lips, and then he had changed. The person who left the room, she didn't recognize him. A branch tapped against the window glass, startling Megan, who quickly ducked under the covers. It's all the fault of the night and the aftermath of the concussion. Everything will look different in the morning. A few days later, Megan sat in the cafe, her hands trembling as she tried to steady them enough to sip her coffee. Her initial attempt failed, and she muttered a curse under her breath. Taking a deep breath and counting to 10, she managed to calm her nerves slightly. She tried again, this time the hot coffee scalding her throat and leaving a bitter aftertaste. Gradually, the tension began to subside. Taking another sip, she turned to the window and grimaced at her reflection. Dark circles under hollow eyes, chapped lips, pale skin, and disheveled hair. "Can I get you anything else?" the waiter asked, appearing beside her table. Megan barely glanced at him before responding curtly, "Nothing, thanks." He disappeared, and Megan immediately regretted not ordering something stronger to drink. A craving to drown her senses in alcohol washed over her, wishing to obliterate all thoughts, especially the fear of the coming night and the dread of returning home. Her mind flashed back to that horrifying night. "Robert, what are you doing?" Megan had frozen in the doorway of the kitchen, staring wide-eyed as Robert devoured a piece of raw meat. The refrigerator door was open, its hum piercing the silence that had awakened her. "Eating," Robert replied indifferently, his gaze fixed on his gruesome task, blood and grime mixing on his lips and fingers, which he seemed to relish with disturbing enjoyment. Megan's head spun, a nightmare seeming to clutch at her heart. Robert. She exhaled helplessly, feeling utterly lost for the first time in her life. "Go back to bed," he finally said, lifting his eyes to hers. Megan recoiled as she saw his pupils constrict to slits and then dilate fully. His teeth, now resembling fangs and smeared with blood, sent a surge of terror through her. Silently, she turned and retreated to the bedroom, curling under the covers and staring blankly ahead, trying to will herself to wake from this nightmare. By morning, Robert was hysterical, staring in horror at his blood-stained fingers, retching over chunks of spoiled meat in the bathroom. He later collapsed into a deep sleep in Megan's arms, crying and trembling. "Megan, what's happening to me?" His voice was laced with terror and confusion. His gray eyes, filled with desperate hope, searched hers for answers. "I don't remember anything. Why did I do this? Why?" Megan could only bite her lip, holding him close, unable to provide any comfort with words. Nighttime was now Megan's enemy. As the sun set and twilight deepened, fear seeped into her heart. Daylight offered some respite, allowing her to avoid seeing the dark circles that had formed around Robert's nearly pallid skin, and the perpetual sorrow that seemed to reside in his eyes, displacing any flicker of hope. They could still play along, pretending all was well, each too afraid to confront their shared pain and fear. "No, Megan, no," Robert whispered fervently, his eyes pleading with her. "They'll commit me to a psychiatric hospital. Sweetheart, I'm still me. I can handle this. Just stay with me. Don't leave me." And Megan stayed. She watched his exhausted face during the day and prayed to every deity she knew at night. Because at night Robert transformed and it terrified her. His voice grew deeper, more animalistic, and Megan couldn't decipher his words. Dogs in the neighborhood howled and pulled at their chains, while Robert only smirked, displaying a row of unnaturally sharp teeth and fangs. Megan no longer left the bedroom at night. As soon as he rose from bed and vanished into the dark corridor, she curled up under the covers, her teeth clenched, as she listened to the rustling and the increasingly familiar growl of Robert's voice. The palpable fear made her flinch when footsteps neared the door. It was terrifying, unnerving, because it was Robert, her gentle, loving Robert. It was he who lay beside her each evening, who clung to Megan with a desperation as if trying to become one with her. But as soon as his gray eyes closed, the nightmare began. Robert didn't touch her, didn't speak to her. It was as if he didn't see her at all. And only in the morning. Megan embraced her real Robert. She soothed him, urged him to sleep. And she watched over his sleep, holding his hand and gently caressing his worn face with her fingertips. He was her beloved, frightened, exhausted, the most beautiful, the most dear, the same Robert whom she couldn't help. While sitting in the cafe, Megan remembered another night, one unlike any other. The stillness that enveloped the house was even more unsettling than the rustling and the growling voice of Robert, to which she had almost grown accustomed. It felt as though the air itself was laden with fear, and a metallic taste lingered on her tongue. Something had changed. This sensation gnawed at her, made her bite her lips. Unable to bear the uncertainty any longer, Megan slipped from bed and moved silently out of the bedroom. She traversed the corridors, descended the stairs to the ground floor, and paused at the foot of the stairs, listening intently to the sounds within the house. In the dim light of the hall, the shapes of objects seemed distorted, as if in a funhouse mirror. The silence was deafening, her own breathing oppressively loud. "Where are you?" Megan mouthed, but her throat produced no sound, as if too frightened to break the deathly quiet. And then she was answered. A draft caressed her bare feet, and the sound of the window frame tapping startled her. Shivering, Megan hesitantly turned towards the partially open living room door. After a moment's hesitation, she pulled the door towards herself, stepped into the room, and froze, her throat constricting. Robert stood by the large mirror, holding a thin, sharp knife, smiling as he watched the thin streams of blood trickle down his face, which appeared almost black in the dim light. Cuts on his forehead, almost at the temple, formed a bizarre pattern, but Megan's mind felt numb, registering the scene without trying to analyze it. She watched, transfixed, as his pink tongue slid over his lips, licking the drops of blood. There was no fear yet. That came later. When Robert looked directly at her, and Megan saw no whites or irises in his eyes, only an absolute terrifying blackness. "Do you like it?" he asked in a hoarse, chilling voice, tilting his head to the side and observing Megan's reaction with interest. "You..." Megan swallowed and moistened her dry lips. "Why?" she asked calmly, her voice slow, though she wanted nothing more than to flee from Robert. "Do you like it?" he repeated, as if he hadn't heard her question. "No," Megan exhaled. She turned away, conscious of his intense gaze on her back. As she took a step forward, a sharp, pain-filled scream echoed behind her, followed by a dull thud. Instantly, Megan spun around and, without a second thought, dashed to where her beloved now lay unconscious on the floor. Nearby, a knife with a blade stained with dried blood gleamed in the dim light. "Robert!" she gasped, dropping to her knees beside him and gently rolling him onto his back. "Robert, what happened?" He groaned softly and his eyes fluttered open, those gray eyes clouded with confusion. "Megan, what?" He reached up, his fingers brushing against the cuts, and he winced. "Don't touch. They need to be treated," she said urgently. Robert pulled away from her, staggered to the mirror, and froze, horror widening his eyes. "What is this?" His hands trembled, and his voice broke as he cried out. "Who did this?" "You did it yourself," Megan replied, her voice a mix of relief and horror, aware that today's ordeal was over but uncertain about what tomorrow would bring. "Megan," he murmured after a moment of heavy silence, his head bowed, his face partially obscured by a lock of hair. "We need to see a doctor. This can't continue." "You didn't want to before," she reminded him gently. "Now it doesn't matter," he rasped, his voice laden with anguish and resignation. "I can't trust myself anymore, and I'm scared for you. I don't know what I'm capable of now." "You've never hurt me. I don't believe you would," Megan asserted, her voice firm. "Are you scared of me?" Robert caught her gaze in the mirror. "Not really," Megan replied, her voice wavering slightly. "I see how you look at me." He touched the dried blood on his forehead. "Sweetheart, I don't want anything bad to happen to you. Do you want to leave me?" Megan reached for him instinctively, grasping his shoulders and pulling him close. "After everything we've been through." But the decision was made. Once Robert agreed to see a doctor, Megan felt a weight lift slightly, hopeful that the nightmare that had haunted her might finally end. That night it did end, and a new day began. Megan fell asleep with Robert in her arms, and when she awoke, the house was eerily quiet. Robert was gone. He wasn't in any of the rooms, not in the garden, not in the garage. The car was missing too. Frowning, Megan began to call him. He answered just as her patience was wearing thin. "I'm listening." His voice was normal, as if nothing had happened. "Where are you?" "I'm at the store doing some shopping," he replied casually. "But we were supposed to go to the doctor today." "I changed my mind," Robert declared abruptly, his tone clipped and decisive. What? But you... Megan began, her voice trailing off in confusion and dismay. It's my life, and I want to live it my way. Right now, I want to have some fun. Megan couldn't see his face, but the smirk in his voice was unmistakable. And what else? Speaking was difficult. Megan struggled to mask her true feelings. This wasn't the Robert she knew. He was someone else, changed inexplicably. But why? The night had already passed. She persisted, her voice soft yet probing. What do you want? First, I'm getting rid of these clothes, he said, his tone casual yet firm. After that, I'll see. The world is vast, and there are so many places I haven't explored yet. What are you saying? I don't understand. Megan's voice quivered as she fought against the rising wave of hysteria. It's nothing important, Megan. Robert's voice was low and soothing, yet it sent an involuntary shiver down her spine. But I could take you with me. I bet you've never really experienced what the world has to offer. Overwhelmed, Megan fell silent. She couldn't fathom why Robert had changed so drastically overnight. Megan, my patience has limits. You can say no, he stated, a hint of irritation creeping into his tone. I'll go with you, Megan replied quickly, her decision tinged with a realization that she might be sealing her fate. Shortly thereafter, they sped off in the car. The speed was furious, the music loud, and Robert's laughter wild and joyous, filling the car and mixing with the rushing wind, leaving Megan breathless with a mixture of exhilaration and terror. She watched the blur of the road, occasionally closing her eyes, then stealing glances at Robert. He was almost unrecognizable now. The scars on his forehead had vanished, and there was no trace of the previous night's horrors. His lips seemed fuller, his cheekbones more defined. He was more handsome and yet somehow more distant. Megan watched him, marveling at how deeply she loved him, yet how frightened she was of him. Robert weaved through traffic with reckless abandon, clearly relishing the adrenaline and the closeness to danger. It seemed he feared nothing anymore. They arrived at a nightclub located on the outskirts of the city, nestled among abandoned warehouses. Drunk patrons milled about, their slurred voices and clumsy movements creating a chaotic atmosphere. Robert took Megan's hand with authority, and they approached the dimly lit entrance. Then she saw it again. The symbol, an inverted cross with fangs, just like the one she had seen at Greenfield Park. The symbol was emblazoned on the wall next to the nightclub's door. A cold fear seized Megan, and she let go of Robert's hand. He looked at her with disdain. "Do you want to leave? To leave me here alone?" he asked, his voice cold and challenging. "No, I'm just surprised. It's an unusual place for a club," Megan whispered, her voice barely audible as she surveyed her surroundings, the dim lights casting long shadows that twisted and turned like the patrons themselves. "You haven't seen anything yet," Robert smirked, pushing her forward. Inside the club, the semi-darkness was pierced by flickering neon lights that cast eerie shadows on the faces of the clubgoers. The music thrummed through the air, its beat almost synchronizing with the pulsing of the crowd's collective heartbeat. The scent of cheap perfume mingled with the electric excitement of the night. Robert and Megan made their way through the throng to the bar, where he ordered cocktails for both of them. Shortly after, Robert excused himself, leaving Megan alone amidst the bustling crowd. She scanned the room, its occupants varied and some with appearances that bordered on the non-human. Despite trying to locate Robert, he had already vanished from sight. In the crowded space, Megan felt an intense gaze upon her. Turning towards it, she noticed a man with a lean face, untouched by the sun, dark eyes, and black hair, a scar marking his temple. His stare was unsettling. Just as she decided to search for Robert, he reappeared. "Come with me. I'll show you what a real night is like," he said, his smile both inviting and enigmatic. Megan followed him, flanked by two strangers who escorted them through the club, past the kitchen, and out a staff exit into a dark alley. The strangers walked away, leaving Megan and Robert alone in the dimly lit alley. "Why are we here?" Megan asked, her voice tinged with fear. "Hush. You'll see everything soon. Just be patient," Robert replied, cutting her off. Suddenly, two inebriated men stumbled into the alley. "Look who we have here," one slurred, his voice nasally. "Hey, girl. She's cute. Will you be mine?" jeered the other. Robert smiled and took a step towards them, seemingly oblivious to the danger they posed. Megan, watching nervously, licked her lips in anticipation. "Back off, or you'll regret it," one of the drunk men started, but was abruptly cut off. In an instant, Robert vanished, and the alley was plunged into darkness. For a moment, there was silence. Then the sounds of rustling and scuffling filled the air, like hundreds of wings fluttering. Megan, recoiling and pressing against the cold alley wall, squinted hard, trying to discern any distinct sounds amidst the chaos. Then a cold sensation tickled her cheek. She flinched, and suddenly the alley was filled with pained screams. These were soon followed by a wolf's piercing howl that then faded away. The rustling ceased, and a heavy silence fell. Megan, heart pounding loudly, feared moving from the wall. She waved her hand in front of her face, a futile, nervous gesture. "Robert?" she whispered into the silence, desperate for a response. In return, the roar of a beast echoed, followed by mad, triumphant laughter. Then light flashed. Megan shut her eyes briefly, then cautiously reopened them. The scene before her was gruesome, bodies torn apart, and there stood Robert, transformed into a beast. Terrified, she ran. She ran without thought, not looking back, until she burst onto a road, nearly running in front of a car that screeched to a halt just in time. "Do you want to die? What's wrong with you?" the frightened driver exclaimed as he jumped out of the car and ran over to Megan. The girl exhaled deeply, her legs trembling as she made her way back to the sidewalk. Ignoring the curious glances of passers-by, she collapsed onto the steps of a closed shop. The horror of what she had seen replayed in her mind. Human bodies smeared across the walls. Her hands began to shake again, and overwhelmed by shock and horror, she started to cry quietly, her hands pressing against her temples, alarming a passerby. Megan's memory of how and where she spent the night was hazy. It seemed she had managed to reach a friend's place, who had let her stay over. And when the sun rose, she decided she could never go home again, because Robert was no longer there. All day she wandered the streets, frightening herself and barely noticing her surroundings. Only by evening did she start to feel slightly better. The shock was subsiding, the fear was dulling, or perhaps she was just becoming accustomed to it. Thoughts of Robert gradually began to creep back into her mind. Megan was no longer certain that she wouldn't go home. Her heart ached, yearning to be where her beloved was. She no longer cared about the nightmare. She felt like she was going insane. She just wanted to return to Robert. Sitting in the cafe, she tried to force herself not to think about what might be waiting for her at home. "Excuse me for intruding, but I think you need help," said the same brunette stranger from the nightclub who had been watching her closely, now standing next to her. "Who are you?" Megan asked, shrugging off his concern. She disliked being followed. "You won't manage on your own with him," the stranger replied calmly, seemingly unaffected by her dismissiveness. "What are you talking about? Who won't I manage with?" "With the one you're, friend has become. Megan, no longer capable of being surprised, only gave a wry smirk. He's just gone insane. The stranger shook his head, then suddenly leaned in close, almost looming over her. Do you really believe that? What do you want? Megan asked, her voice weary. I want to help you. The dark blue eyes of the stranger gleamed intensely. I don't need help. You don't understand. If he's not stopped. Go away, Megan said hoarsely, her voice tinged with fear. I don't want to hear this nonsense anymore. You... Her phone rang, interrupting the conversation. Megan froze, her eyes fixed ahead as she answered the call. I'm listening. Megan. Robert's familiar voice struck her heart, and she let out a soft moan. Robert. Megan whispered into the phone. Megan, where are you? Robert's voice came softly, filled with distress. Before her eyes, an image formed. Her beloved huddled in a chair, biting his lip in an attempt to stifle his rising hysteria. I'm scared. I'm so scared. Robert. Megan's voice faltered, her eyes stinging with tears. I'll be there soon. Just hold on a bit. You'd better stay away from this house. Robert's pleading tone suddenly turned cold and slightly hoarse, cutting through the phone and jarring her nerves. Megan flinched and shouted back into the phone. Who are you? What do you want? It doesn't matter. They laughed on the other end. Just don't come back here, never again. Otherwise, I'll kill you. The connection cut off, and Megan slowly lowered the phone, her hand trembling. Who? Was that him? The stranger from earlier, whom Megan had nearly forgotten, reached out to her, but she pushed him away and bolted out of the cafe. She ran past the houses, her mind racing. To hell with everything. Robert is there. Her beloved. He's there. Megan heard him, felt him. He's there, waiting for her. She arrived at her house. The streetlights were off, casting the street into darkness, as if life itself had receded. Even the sound of a taxi's departing engine seemed distant, almost spectral. Fear gripped her, causing her body to tremble, but perhaps she was just tired of being scared. Megan climbed the steps to the porch, pushed open the door, which was strangely unlocked, and entered. Robert? She called out, navigating by memory and touch, pausing at the threshold of the living room, listening to the oppressive silence. Oddly, she hadn't been here for just over a day, but it felt like an eternity had passed. She stood there for a long moment, holding her breath and straining her eyes in the darkness. Then a gust of wind swept through the house, and suddenly hundreds of candles lit up around her. They were everywhere there was space to stand. It was strange she hadn't noticed them when she entered, but in such darkness. I told you not to come here. Robert's voice, both familiar and alien, echoed around her, and Megan shook her head. Where are you? Who exactly do you need? Robert? The voice coiled around her, both chilling and caressing. Megan no longer heard any hoarseness in it. It was the voice of her beloved, but altered, deeper, fuller, commanding. Yes, Megan breathed out, her voice barely audible. I won't leave without him. You lovebirds are so amusing. Where is he? He's not here. The candle flames flickered. Megan blinked, and when her eyes opened, Robert was standing before her. His gray eyes with pulsating pupils looked at her with interest and a mocking sneer. Megan stared back for a long moment, then sighed hopelessly. Robert. The essence of his spirit, her love, faintly glowed in the depths of his eyes. It was barely perceptible, but Megan knew it, saw it, felt it. Robert. Megan reached out to the figure before her. With a startled cry, she withdrew her hand as it grazed elongated claws. Don't you dare touch me, Robert's voice came, his pupils dilating until the whites of his eyes were engulfed in darkness. Megan recoiled, inhaling sharply through clenched teeth. Lines formed on his once smooth, pale forehead, tracing a sinister pattern she remembered from that horrific night. "Who are you?" "A demon wolf," a voice from behind made Megan spin around. Dark blue eyes met hers, and her heart skipped a beat. It was the same brunette stranger from the nightclub. Suddenly, everything around her seemed to whirl out of control. A shadow darted forward, brushed against her, and threw her aside. Megan collided with something, but the adrenaline numbed any pain. Clanging, growling, and screams filled the air. The candle flames flared up, reaching toward the ceiling before dwindling into near nothingness. Shadows darted across the walls, and a howl split the air. Then silence fell. Megan shivered as a rough, uneven breath brushed against her in the darkness. She felt on the verge of shattering, unable to endure another moment of this nightmare. Then a faint glimmer appeared. It trembled weakly, but to Megan, it was a beacon of hope. It flickered away, and moments later, the room brightened slightly as the candles reignited, each new flame intensifying her relief, yet reminding her of the terror she'd endured. Covering her face with her hands, she tried to steady her shaking and control her sobs. "Hey, are you okay?" A heavy hand rested on her shoulder, and Megan reluctantly lowered her hands. She turned to see the stranger squatting in front of her, his gaze fixed on a body entwined with chains on the floor. "Robert." Her voice faltered, but she was beyond caring. The stranger exhaled in relief and turned as well. "I'm lucky he hasn't regained his full strength yet. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to subdue him." "Who are you?" Megan's mind cleared as she began to grasp the situation. "An exorcist," the stranger shrugged, standing up and pulling her to her feet. "Get up. We don't have much time." "For what?" Megan frowned, a mix of confusion and exhaustion clouding her thoughts. The stranger's look was one of regret as he stepped back. "Sit down. I'll deal with the demon wolf for now. Do you have a basement?" Megan nodded automatically, watching as the stranger kneeling slid his hands under Robert. The chains rattled, snapping her back to the moment. "Stop. What's wrong with him?" "Unconscious for now. He needs to be restrained. Otherwise, we're all in danger," he said, lifting Robert with ease and heading for the door. "By the way, my name is Brad." As Megan watched Brad maneuver through the doorway, she walked over to a chair in the kitchen and sat down. For a few moments she stared blankly into space, then rested her forehead on her hands on the table. Images flickered before her eyes. Robert's voice still echoed in her ears. Inside, though, there was emptiness, and a surreal calm. Fear had vanished. So had astonishment, disbelief, and confusion. Only a cold curiosity remained, blending with a surreal feeling. Perhaps that was why, when Brad appeared at the kitchen doorway, Megan simply looked up with a blank expression and said, "I'm ready to listen." Brad, with a wry smile, sat down across from her. After a moment of heavy silence, he asked, "What do you want to know?" "Everything. What's wrong with Robert, where you came from, and what's happening in general?" "Really everything," Brad sighed. "I'm not in a rush. Your beloved is possessed. Do you understand what that means?" "I do. Demons, rituals, exorcisms. But that's stuff for horror movies." Megan internally scrambled for a rational explanation to dismiss the nightmarish thoughts. "You need to understand that werewolves are demonic beings, resembling beasts with claws and fangs. We often think of them as just tales of humans transforming into wolves, but..." "How did this happen?" Megan cut him off. In the park, Brad paused briefly. That's where it happened to him. Megan tensed up, a muffled groan escaping her as she pressed her temples, memories flooding back. Fragmented words, sensations, people. All dressed in black, faces hidden, fire all around. A stone altar, and on it, Robert, trembling, helpless. Pain shot through her hands as she tried to reach him, but she was restrained. A shadow, dark and terrifying, swirling around Robert. The wind howled as the shadow drew nearer, thickening, reaching for him. It touched his lips, and Robert screamed, convulsing. They restrained him while Megan moaned, cried, and pleaded. The shadow flowed into his mouth like a thin stream, blackening his lips. Then darkness. Megan lifted her head, breathing heavily. What was that? What you had forgotten. Brad exhaled deeply. Originally, another was meant to be the vessel for the werewolf spirit. He volunteered, so I watched over him. I don't know what went wrong, but he ended up killing himself. I thought we were safe, but it was premature. They found another victim, or rather, she walked right into their hands. And now? Now? Brad's expression hardened. I was supposed to perform the ritual that same day, before the demon could strengthen in your friend. But his followers began to hunt me, and I had other concerns. Now it's too late. Robert is lost, so he must be killed. I can't let you kill him, Megan stated calmly, rising to her feet, relieved to feel steady on her legs. As long as there's even a spark of Robert's soul in him, you won't touch him. Are you certain that he still has a soul? Yes, I can feel it. Brad pondered. Then, after a few minutes, he reluctantly agreed. I'll regret this, but let's try to bring your beloved back. They paused at the top of the stairs leading down to the basement. Megan hesitated, thinking about her fear, while Brad waited patiently. After taking a few deep breaths, Megan flipped the switch. The door below was outlined in light. Slowly, giving herself time to think it over, she carefully made her way down, careful not to trip. With each step, her heart pounded harder. The door swung open quietly with a gentle push, and Megan stepped inside. Come to visit an old friend? A horrific creature covered in thick fur, a werewolf, a demon, stood before her. It waved its hand, causing the chain attached to a ring in the wall to jingle. Come to exorcise me? How foolish! I'm older, much older than your God. Your prayers, crosses, and holy water mean nothing to me. A surprise awaits your exorcist. Don't listen to him, Megan, he's deceiving you. That's what they do, Brad cut in. But you're in chains, Megan noted, surprisingly fearless. Even the black, pupilless eyes no longer scared her. It won't last. The spell's effectiveness is diminishing, the werewolf informed her politely. What do you want? Who are you? Robert, the creature said with a twisted smirk. Don't you dare speak his name, Megan snapped, her anger flaring. Here we go again. I enjoy this, the demon laughed. Megan, stay here. You're his link to the human world, Brad said, as he began sprinkling a circle of silver dust around the chained Robert. The powder shimmered as Brad started chanting arcane words, filling the air with a heavy sense of purification. The werewolf struggled, the chains clanging loudly. Foolish, this is foolish. This body is mine now. I'll tear you apart, exorcist, the demon growled. Brad continued his chant, then took a handful of silver dust, took a deep breath, and blew it forcefully towards the werewolf, dispersing it into the air. The demon convulsed violently. When it looked up again, its eyes were hollow. It looked at Megan. Darling, it hurts. I'm scared. Stop this. Help me. Don't look into his eyes, Megan. Demons prey on your soul at your weakest." Brad's voice was soft, yet each word seemed to pierce the darkness. "You can't stop me," the werewolf roared, and suddenly the basement was plunged into absolute darkness. "Megan, don't move!" Brad shouted, his voice echoing as he continued to recite the prayer in an unknown language. Megan heard a cacophony of sounds: howling, the flapping of wings, growling, and chaotic noise. A wave of heat washed over her, swiftly replaced by an unbearable chill. Robert's pleading voice echoed in her ears, mingled with curses and voices speaking in hundreds of different languages. She felt as if she were plummeting into a bottomless abyss, her consciousness fading. Suddenly, a touch on her hand and a bitter taste in her mouth snapped her back to reality. Opening her eyes, she saw Brad in front of her. "Don't get up. You're tired. Everything is fine," Brad said, sitting beside her as she lay on the floor. "What happened?" she asked weakly. Brad didn't reply directly. Instead, he pointed to Robert, who was also lying on the floor, now back in human form. "We did it, though I'm not entirely sure how stable it is. I'll keep an eye on you, and if something goes wrong, I'll come back to finish what we started," Brad declared, rising and walking towards the basement exit. Before stepping over the threshold, he turned back and added, "You're strong." Then the exorcist left. Megan struggled to her feet and, swaying slightly, approached Robert. She sat down next to him and began to stroke his head. After a while, Robert's eyes fluttered open and he looked at her. "Good morning, my sweetheart. It seems I've been asleep for too long."